And just in general,
Like I'm here to mess this up.
authority is very interesting, and I don't appreciate how authority is kind of page based.
Right. Yeah.
And actually, I'm getting a book. Well, I do have a book I'm reading from Dr. Campolo's library. I want to say it's called Obedience to Authority. It's like a research book, I guess, about like different experiments they did with obedience and like how authority plays a role.
No, I think about this all the time too. So I was having a conversation with some faculty just the other day, and part of it was like some challenges around getting students to kind of like participate in the conversation. And it's like group conversation, so not in front of all the people. And so one of the things that I've found to be successful is honestly like as long as you've prepared students like groups and discussion questions, other stuff like that, if you just leave the room, oftentimes they'll begin speaking. And part of it, I believe, is because many young people have been so conditioned to where if you're in a room and there's somebody who is older than you and standing up, it is your job to listen, not to talk. And so if you leave the room for a moment, because it's leaving the room matters because I can say, all right, now I want you to speak with each other, but they're like very practiced to just look at the authority figure in the room. Oftentimes the person who's oldest, right? So if you just take that away, they have no, then it's like, oh, like, there's no reason to like defer to their attention because they're not there anymore. But it's a lot of it's conditioned, right?
Yeah, I've had a lot of like, especially this summer, the past summer, just like interesting experiences with myself as like an authority person. Because
I loved it.
I started doing like a summer camp for like younger kids. I was working with like middle schoolers, and occasionally I was like with like kids. And then I was also an RA in every school this past summer.
I was in RA governor school for years.
Oh yeah.
Yep.
So it was very interesting, especially because like I'm not that much older than them. So like balancing that, like, being an authority figure, but also I hate when people are like super authoritarian. So I try to at least like have a level of respect that was gained from like, I guess relatability or like understanding.
Absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense.
They really have.
Now I will say that I was very strict with rules, but I just had to be. I mean,
I mean,
they really
having done that job, you're absolutely correct.
Like,
right? And in a way, it's just like if you are not
think about it in terms of like
enforcing those. So if you're not holding yourself to like enforce the rules, then it can spin out quickly. Even ones that like seem small.
Wow, this is supposed to be bad.
And I'm sure I totally. Whenever I was doing that job, it just was 2009 to probably 2014, because my first year in graduate school, I came back to Arkansas Governor School and I led all the rest of my stuff. So I was Area 4 coordinator. But anyway, one of the big ones at that point in time was like the cell phones. So I don't know what the rules are now because it's been 10 years. But back then it was always just like, so give me 6 weeks of your time where you leave your phone in your room and you don't just sit in your room, and I promise you will find ways to appreciate it.
And I could see that.
But it was challenging, and
I just write like
there were also times where it's just like, do we really have to follow this? Yeah, you do.
Yeah,
similar.
I had a couple times where I had to like look after phones. That was mainly for like,
I mean,
our group, we had like a big like floor community group meeting or like an activity together. There always be like a group that's like really focused on activity, and then there'd be people trying to like be on their phones. And phones are like, they allow phones now at government school. So I had to make like a personal rule. I had to lie a little bit and say that they could be on their phones, but we
haven't played live yet.
And our biggest thing really was lanyards. They have these lanyards that say AGS.
Name tags was a big thing for us too because people didn't want to wear them. But also, and I imagine this is especially true at Tech, where it's not a closed off campus. When it was here, we had formal control of the campus except for like some research kinds of things. But at Tech it's different. But with those name tags, it's like a security thing.
And it was That's a little annoying, like, to have to, like, remind them at the same time, like, you know, I don't wanna be the guy who's like a nitpick about language, but I have to do it because, like, especially on, I was on tech campus, there's already football players there, like, at the time, and just like, anyone can show up, and, I mean, like, I don't know, if I'm supposed to be like the authority figure, there's responsibility, like, over everyone else, and, like, I have to be able to tell if there's like someone talking to a minor who shouldn't be, or like,
Right.
A lot
hey,
of.
if there's like a situation where I need to step in, and I visually, I need to be like,
Yeah,
from a wall.
yeah, I know, I've had those feelings, yeah, for sure. It's interesting to think that that was over 10 years ago, and that was a big thing, for sure.
She is in the, I think, sociology department.
So you were a big reader?
I enjoy reading, during the semester, it's hard to get a lot of reading done, but, I'm helped because I'm part of a book club with a bunch of alumni from the college, so I graduated in 2013. And some of my closest friends, we started a book club, it's a bit peculiar, we all have PhDs, but in different fields.
Yeah.
And so the way that we pick books is each person takes turns choosing a book, and the rule is it has to be nonfiction and it has to be outside of their field of expertise. So I will say we have somebody in the group who has a PhD in history, and a lot of the books that other people choose are on history. So sometimes he just has that advantage.
Yeah.
But people have chosen books on like the economy, and so two of us have PhDs in economics and stuff like that. So I'm reading nonfiction pretty consistently from that, and then I listen to fiction now. So yeah, I really enjoy fiction, but I've started to use it more like whenever I'm driving or other circumstances like that. So what do you tend to read?
But they moved from New York City.
I read a lot of fiction, but I'm making more to nonfiction lately.
Yeah.
Wow. How did that go?
I try to read like all of the stuff my friends give me, and not like as like a, you know, I don't know, it's weird, but I feel like when someone assigns something, it's like easier to read it for me because it's like, you know,
It's why book club helps me.
because it's like they allow me to read certain parts, like I have to read anyways. And it's always like really interesting stuff that we get assigned. And I was a serial book not reader in high school. I skipped a couple books in my day, so you know, Spark Notes really.
Spark notes are useful, but you do miss a lot.
You
like
do.
It's useful in terms of class preparation, but there's a lot that's in those books that
Probably
you know you're not going to be asked questions. You're not going to be asked a test question.
Didn't work as my
But
first one in the sense.
Yeah, because my first semester last year, I took a class with Ken Polo about Mark Twain.
Awesome.
Yeah, and a lot of stuff that was in those books, like
Necessarily.
you can't get that from Spark Notes, or like you wouldn't get that from like the quizzes we did were pretty much like standard did you read stuff. So it was never like really in depth.
How you doing?
Just kind of making sure that there are
Oh, you do?
benchmarks that are
Do you know
pushing
Dr. Stover?
yeah, extent like pushing you through the book.
Yeah, so it was like a lot of the knowledge I got was from like actually reading and engaging with material. It was really interesting, like I said.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that. That's an author that you know is such a big part of American culture, and also like, even if you just consider
Last semester, we
how
figured out
much
what
time we
real.
attribute to like comic.
Yeah.
Right? Like
out,
if you
right?
think about
Yeah.
books
So
or
The
television
other
or
day
whatever,
someone asked me if I ever
he
figured
was
like
huge
out what was
in
real,
just
and I was like,
creating that
well.
and yet I have not read or studied much Mark Twain. My brother, he teaches English, and he has kind of set a goal for himself to read a few more of like the kind of classic authors. So he has been, a few years ago, he read a bunch of Mark Twain as an adult. He's like, yeah, this is great.
Yeah,
It's just really good writing.
Like this Odyssey
And there's like
idea,
fun things that you can
and
do.
I just went and talked with the Odyssey office about like if the funding was like reasonable.
No, a Yankee.
Because I wanted to do, I decided that I'm gonna double major in
That's Mark Twain,
econ business and study the mind,
But yeah, so like
and I
that's
don't,
not a
I'm
children's
having
story, but it's
problems
like fun.
figuring out how to combine
Yeah.
them.
And it goes
and I have a
quickly,
text
or so my
apprenticeship
brother told me.
That starts
So,
over
like,
Christmas
Like,
break.
it was an American
And,
Yankee and King Arthur's Court.
Because
I
I'm
think it was
requesting
something like
funding
that.
to pay for
But,
the apprenticeship.
But
They
yeah,
said it
so-
like,
This looks
the amount was
very
reasonable
interesting,
to,
and even just like on the basic level,
but I was trying to
Other very
find a
good,
way
it's
to
not what I
like
thought
maybe
it
do
was.
some sort
When
of
I
research
read it
while I'm
again,
there, like
college,
have like a
was
survey
really
and have
great,
people answer the survey.
had a lot of like
And
small
then
or short stories that
Maybe
were
comparing like
like,
willingness to
funny,
pay
but
for
also
like
had like really heavy
self-expression.
philosophical
Like that
context.
kind of
Oh,
thing.
yeah, cool.
But I
And I
wanna
mean,
like
I
display
would
the
say
data in a way
that's
that's like
actually something that
easily like
is worth
kind of like an art project out of it,
recognizing
like
his work, like, because we
maybe
see it
create like
today.
a
Yeah.
Venn
Comedy is
diagram
often used
with,
to
like,
talk about
the
heavy issues,
generalized
right? Or
tattoos
contemporary
and correlation with like
events, social
price and
things that
stuff
are
and like
happening
kind of
around
build a
us
model
that are
about it.
often difficult to
That's
talk
I know
about.
that it wouldn't be
Comedians
like a
talk
very
about,
good,
and yes,
It's just one
sometimes it's
tattoo place, like it's not gonna be,
irreverent,
But
we
just
can
like-
put it that way. But
know,
other
just to
times,
do
like,
something
there's
really,
depth
like,
and insight
kind of
in it, so
start to
so I think
understand
that,
like how to research something and
that's a valuable quality of that.
That sounds great, yeah, I mean, there's lots of like,
Really interesting.
there's lots of like empirical aesthetics approaches that use different like social science models, right? So it would be like kind of comparative, like what are people willing to pay?
Yeah.
And how does that relate to their aesthetic expression? You wouldn't have to have it be a study, it could just be, you're asking them,
Mhm.
right, about why they do what they do.
Yeah.
That would be interesting, yeah. Let's talk about it.
And like I'm just looking for like a professor to help, and I don't know who would be interested.
I'll do that.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's meet in office hours and talk about it. Hello, how are you?
Tired.
Are you available next week for a discussion?
So I'm in a sticky position with that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm using these discussions for for my senior thesis,
Mm-hmm.
for my anthropology degree,
Oh,
because my thesis is actually on this topic, which I didn't know we were discussing in the Steel Center, so I was like, I'm gonna use this.
so you can't be a participant, or can you be a participant observer in the
I-
methodology?
Participant observation, yes, I don't know, if I'd have to talk to Dr. Goldberg and see what the rules are if I could give a talk, but I think that might conflict with my research,
Okay,
so.
that's interesting.
Yeah, plus then I also wouldn't be able to stay, cause like right after this, I have to run over to the swimming pool for practice, so.
Yeah.
That sounds really neat.
It's gonna be a good,
Sounds really neat, yeah.
I already did some partial research on it in my
Dr.
ethnographic
Dow,
methods
I'm just
class.
gonna wait for you to.
So.
Yeah, I'll introduce you.
Well, you don't have to introduce me, just tell me when I can go.
Yeah. Well, and
So-
I'll just say hi to everybody.
Yeah,
My
Make sure
specific
that-
thesis is on the student athlete, non-athlete divide on campus.
Oh my god, we have to talk.
It's very, yeah, so I'm still working on all that research and I
I'd like
have
to buy
like,
you lunch sometime.
okay, maybe I'll take it.
also coffee's great.
Yeah, so
You
I'm
digging it?
still.
Yeah,
still
I
have to
always
send
get
some,
the
like,
off-road one,
proposals in
like
for
the
HSRD.
green label
This is
Ethiopian
different because
Yeah.
beans,
it's
and I
a
enjoy
public
that one a lot. It's
presentation.
really nice.
This
So,
one's the hitchhiker
There's
one, I
like,
think.
there's
Nice,
Yeah.
sweet.
great areas that I'm still.
Have
trying
you
to
been
figure
to,
out, and I'm working with Dr. Goldberg on
Big
figuring that
Cup
research
in
out.
Malta?
I haven't.
Oh, yeah.
You'll have to come out.
I'm
believe I've
I'm
actually
familiar
been-
with it by name, because I've gone to
For
Point Remove
orientation,
a few
yes.
times and it's just down the street now.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I kind of like.
So yeah, I'll have to check it out.
Jumping around in 10
Well,
different areas.
come out from there, probably, 'cause I live out there, right?
Yeah,
So-
exactly.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, yeah, happy to do that.
Yeah,
All right.
I actually just left a message.
Well, welcome everybody to the Steel Center discussion on a Wednesday afternoon. Most of you know that the Steel Center was formed to engage in the academic study of philosophy and religion. And one of the things that we do is have discussions. We've had them since the 80s. So we're, by doing this, participating in a long history of having deep discussions about difficult topics. One of the series we're having this semester is Bridges Across Harkrider. And the idea is to talk about something that faculty and students and staff and everyone in the community is wondering about. Is there an athlete, non-athlete divide? And what does that really mean? And one of the ways that we thought would be a good way to like talk about it would be to have faculty talk about sports and then eventually have people that are coaches and involved in athletics come and talk about ideas, right? And then to have students as well lead discussions. So I want to say before we begin that tell your friends that next week is open. If students want to lead a discussion, I've left it open. And if they want to continue the conversation and then bridges across Harkrider, then please let me know. Or if you just know of anyone who wants to, okay? And today we're pleased that Dr. Hayden Chomposi of Economics is going to be presenting and talking
environmental
today.
studies.
And environmental studies, right, where we're on the same crew there, so I shouldn't forget that. And we're very grateful to William for being willing to lead the discussion today. Of former Hendricks student. I guess you're always a Hendricks.
Yeah, well, I'm
member
a
of the
lifelong
community.
learner, so I'm
Lifelong
learning
learner.
from Hendricks folks all the time, but I graduated in 2013.
Yeah. So professional student still, as I am.
Yeah.
Right? And also plays sports and played.
So I spent 4 years as a member of the Hendricks Ultimate Frisbee team, non-NCAA, but very consistently practicing and competing organization. So from 2009 to 2013, I was part of that team and I played. I actually made an all-region first team list one year, so that was kind of neat. Again, it's not NCAA, so might undercut what that means to be all region. Basically, the people that I played against were we know that person's name, and that was enough. But yeah, and I still participate in their practices now as their advisor. So yeah.
And I met Champa when I came here 13 years ago, and he welcomed me to the climbing wall. So
that's right.
That was a wonderful experience. So yeah, let's welcome Dr. Hayden Chomposi and thank him for leading the discussion today.
Thank you all so much just for kind of participating in this. I'm excited for the series as a whole. I also want to thank Dr. Deb Scope for introducing us to the series last week with a conversation that kind of focused on kind of the Hendricks community and this big question about how athletes are part of the community and then how can we embrace that connection a little bit more. So in my talk, it will be a little bit different in the sense that I'm going to be speaking about sports, but very much from an economics perspective. And so part of my philosophy when Dr. Dow and I were speaking about this was thinking about how sports is part of our lives, and that can include in academic contexts as well. And for me as an economist, I like to often see things in the world that give me economics questions, because that's part of what drew me into that study in general. I think that I know that we're going to talk about economics today, but I think that there are questions from many disciplines, and it's one of the great things about the liberal arts, that you can see in the pastimes, activities, events, the things that we hold dear, right? So whether you're studying history or philosophy, biology, whatever it is, you can ask those types of disciplinary questions within contexts about the things that matter to you. And so I kind of was a pseudo athlete in college. I still continue to just really enjoy being active and spending time outside. And I'm a watcher of sports. A spectator of sports. That sounds a little bit better than a watcher. Watcher sounds kind of creepy. So I'm gonna set that to the side. So one of the things that I want to establish before I kind of get into the talk here is, this is going to be an economics lecture. It's going to be non-technical, and I've put myself on a timer. I'm going to try and keep the technical discussion short, but I do want to demonstrate that we can have academic conversations about the things that we care about, even though it may not always feel like it's in the classroom. So you'll see some graphs, you'll see an equation. You're not going to be tested. Don't pay attention to that stuff if you don't want to, but it's a demonstration of how these two worlds can be together, right? So after 20 minutes, I'm going to stop lecturing and we're just going to have a conversation, hopefully based on some of the ideas that get introduced within the lecture. So sports economics, but specifically focusing on the labor market. Part of what prompted me to think about this topic, was how often I see representations of the economy in sports stories and headlines, specifically labor markets. So within the past week, a human being named Dak Prescott, who plays quarterback for the Dallas Cowboys, signs a new contract, and everybody now knows how much money this person makes. That's crazy. Pardon me, let me rephrase that. That is unprecedented outside the world of sports, right? In a lot of circumstances, and we'll focus on entertainment a bit, but you don't always hear how much money Hugh Jackman makes in a year, right? But they have similar jobs. They entertain people, right? We also have conversations about wealth inequality. That takes place outside the world of sports, but it's very prominent within the world of sports too. And this has been a growing trend, not just from 2 years ago, when there were a lot of discussions about the US women's national team and the pay disparity between them and men's national team. But even now, as we see a growth in popularity among Women's National Basketball Association and conversations around the pay there, right? And once again, we're just seeing more and more and bigger numbers associated with individual people who are doing a job, right? And how much money they get paid for that job. So I think about this in the labor context all the time, and I want to introduce that to students a little bit. So first, if we're going to talk about a labor market, I want to establish what markets are and their relevance within the world that's around us, right? Starting really basic level in terms of defining economic systems, right? So in my classes where I teach about economic systems, I focus on resource allocation. Economics applies to a lot of other things. There's political economy, there's philosophies around economic systems. But the way that I talk about it, there's a system of interactions between independent agents. And when I say agents, I'm talking about people who have the capacity to make decisions. Also, I'm speaking quickly. I'm going to try to slow down. So agents are people who have decision-making power, right? All of you have some amount of agency by the very fact that you chose to come to this talk today, right? Well, the decisions that agents make in markets is how we allocate resources. So, in a capitalist economy, which is to say an economy based on market interactions, interactions take place between consumers and producers in the context of markets, and that's how we see resources going to different places. That's really kind of a foundational element of this. And I hope that we get there in our discussion, but sometimes, and pardon me, I'm not going to go backwards because I'll take too much time. I've often had conversations like, do we really need to pay a baseball player $700 million, right? And isn't there something wrong with that? Well, in this economic structure, we don't have a plan for where people should spend their money. If Shohei Ohtani, who is a baseball player, is being paid $700 million, that's because at some stage, people are willing to pay a lot of money to watch that person do that thing. That's freedom, right? Is freedom good? I don't know, I'm waving a flag, right? Yeah. So yes. Like that's essentially one thing that we can talk about here, right? Should these people be paid that much money? Is a little bit different question than should we allow people to spend money how they want? And that could lead to some individuals being paid $700 million for playing a sport, or pardon me, competing in a sport at the highest level in a way that has never been seen before. Those are two ways to say the same thing. One sounds flippant and disrespectful. One may be aggrandizing somebody who is playing a game. We're going to think differently about that, but economics is one way that we can explain it. So look at this. Taking you back to your high school, college level econ courses. This is a supply and demand model. In economics, we use models as a simplification of complex realities to develop some kind of intuition so that we can learn more about the world, okay? So if we have many markets that allocate resources in society, the supply and demand model is one way that we can study those markets and those interactions. Any market requires three things: a good or a service that can be exchanged, that relates to like property rights. You need consumers who want that good and producers who are willing to provide that good. Within a market, we have a quantity of that exchangeable good and service. We have a price, which is essentially how much we value that exchangeable good and service. We have a community of consumers will represent their behavior with a demand function. And then we have a community of producers who we will represent their behavior with a supply function. I hope I did not break that. Pardon me. So within this model, we can see how consumers interact with producers to essentially agree upon a price. One of the things I want students to take away from my economics courses is that prices represent values that we assign to things, right? Yeah, sometimes that just means how much does something cost. If this were, let's say, tickets for a baseball game, the price of a ticket being high in some way reflects how much consumers value that thing. And so if you're willing to spend $250 to go to the Super Bowl, that must mean something to you, right? That's one of the ways that I want students to think about prices. What is valuable to our society? What is valuable to you? It's not just money and dollars. I mean, yeah, it's those things, but there's also something deeper to it, right? Okay, so no quizzes. Don't worry too much about this model. It's just a representation of a market. For today, I want to focus on a specific type of market, which is the labor market. In comparison to markets for goods and services, we need to make some conceptual adjustments within that supply and demand model. In the previous model, I usually introduce that to talk about the exchange of goods and services. Well, an individual's labor in some ways is a service, right? So I work here at Hendrix College. I am compensated for my labor. I provide a service, which is to create educational opportunities for excited and eager students. Pardon my synonyms there, that was redundant, but I'm paid for that, right? But it changes how we think about consumers and producers within a market context. Within the labor market, the employers are the consumers. That feels weird to say because we often think of consumers as people who buy stuff. And we often think of employers as people who sell those things. In a labor market, it's different because we're fundamentally talking about an input to production, right? Not the output of production. So in a labor market, the employers are represented by a labor demand function. That will be the focus of our kind of technical material for today. And then the employees are represented by the labor supply function because they are bringing their service to the market in the form of their knowledge, expertise, time, efforts. I think I may have already said that, but that they're bringing their good to market, right? In a well-functioning labor market, these two groups should negotiate on the price of that good or service. In a labor market, the price is a very specific thing, it's the wage, in order to maximize the net benefits going to both parties. There are some really strong assumptions that are buried within here, which is why I use the word well-functioning, and I think it should say should in there, right? Another topic that I speak with students from time to time, and I'll just kind of bury this seed, maybe it'll come in when we get to discussion, is whether or not there's even bargaining power in all labor markets. Professional sports associations are actually really good examples of labor unions, but in some labor markets, such as, I don't know, college athletics, there's only one person who will employ you, which is the NCAA. And do they have more bargaining power than all of the people who might work with them or work for them? Those might be college athletes. That's another big economic question. We can get there, but we'll leave it for the discussion. So I've reproduced the supply and demand model, but in the specific context of a labor market, drawing on some of the information I introduced in the previous slide. Instead of prices, we have wages because that's the specific price on labor. Instead of a quantity, I have labor. This could be measured in hours. It could be measured in employees. There are different ways that we could apply it. But we still have demand and supply. I've used a subscript to represent that this is the supply of labor and the demand for labor. Once again, let's keep in mind who our community is. These are employers. Demand for labor are employers. Supply of labor, those are the employees. So in order for people to work more, they have to be paid a higher wage. This is a very simplistic representation. We could show all sorts of non-linearities in this if we wanted to, but we're going to leave it as it is. And then in the demand function, we have a decreasing slope, which is to say, if employers could offer lower wages, they would hire more people, pay for more hours worked, whatever that sort of thing is. So I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about what is buried within the demand for labor, and particularly what actually kind of drives employers to offer different wages, all right? We can imagine all sorts of things that influence the wages that people are willing to accept, such as alternative opportunities, things like that. But for today, I want us to focus on demand for labor. All right, here's our one equation. Oh, it's pretty sweet, okay? So in theory, employers who are the consumers within this market, they should be willing to pay a wage that is up to, so at less than or equal to the value of the marginal product of labor. So it's a very kind of complex term. maybe it's not complex, maybe it just has a bunch of syllables. We're in college, we're doing it, right? Got all the syllables, that's great. The value of the marginal product of labor is essentially just describing how much extra money is generated by one more unit of labor, okay? So the value of the marginal product of labor is given by the price of whatever the good is that's being sold. If we're kind of talking about the sports labor market, you might think about like ticket prices, maybe. And then the marginal product of labor is what that unit of labor contributes to the production of that good or service. So let's say that the price is the price of a ticket, and the marginal product of labor is some athlete's activity that gets one more person to sign up, or pardon me, one unit of their activity that gets people to buy more tickets. Does that kind of make sense in a hand wavy sense? Feel free to ask questions at any point. The big punchline to this, yes, please.
How do you measure that?
Yes, love that, because that is a huge question. That would be on the next slide.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, that's great, right? Because it's hard to think about that, especially if we start to think of all the varied ways that sports exist within our society, right? So we're gonna get there. Great question. Essentially though, we're making an argument or an assumption, or we're making a theory that says, if you're going to employ somebody, you should be thinking about, well, if I have them work one more hour, how much more revenue am I going to get? That's essentially what the right-hand side of that equation is saying, okay? If you can get a good estimate on that, then you have an idea of what the maximum amount of money you can pay them is, okay? An outcome of that theory is that the most productive workers should receive the highest wages in a well-functioning market. Do we think that actually happens in professional sports labor markets? To help us with it, this question is too big. That's yes, no, or it's either too big or too small, depending on how you look at that question. Yes, no questions, stupid, pardon me. Yes, no questions bury a lot of detail that's interesting to talk about. So let's think instead about who gets paid the most. Are they necessarily the most productive people? And that leads us to, how do we define productivity within the context of professional sports? I don't think that's an easy answer if you just want one thing. It gets interesting if you recognize that there's a variety of ways that we can measure productivity. So let's make an assumption that or just accept something together for now. That in professional sports, we're fundamentally talking about entertainment. Right? I know that it means more to some people, and it can mean different things, such as like cultural value and a sense of identity and things that are bigger than entertainment, right? But from a market perspective, if we had to put it into a market, I would say entertainment would be a broad but accurate generalization, okay? What components represent productivity within entertainment? I think that a lot of people watch sports for elements of competition, or participate in sports for elements of competition. Right? So productivity is like, how much more effective is Shohei Ohtani at winning a game for the Los Angeles Dodgers than Adley Rutschman, who is a baseball player for the Baltimore Orioles, right? That's one measure of productivity. Who contributes more to winning the game? And for a particular sport, you could actually break that down into incremental units, because we have things like goals scored, minutes played, errors, tackles. One question that I enjoy asking my student athletes is, what is a triple-double within your sport? A triple-double in basketball is having 3 statistics that contribute positively towards winning a game, being in double digits. Oftentimes it's points scored, rebounds, assists, right? There's a line from a Kanye West song, which is triple-double, no assists. Sounds like a pretty selfish but very talented player to me. My point is, in terms of productivity and competition, we could come up with ways to measure that productivity. So within lacrosse, maybe it's goals scored, tackles made, and assists. If you tackled somebody 10 times, you're probably playing box to box and getting injured, right? So I'm trying to use words that maybe are relevant. In swimming, I have no idea what a triple double would be. It's hard to imagine. But we have metrics because sports are something that we measure all the time, right? So we can come up with that. Another element of not recreation, but entertainment, right? Is marketing. How much more advertising dollars do you generate, right? I'm going to bring this back to the US women's national team in soccer and US men's national team, right? Whenever the women's national team was saying, why aren't we paid as much as the men when our competitive outcomes are so much better? There was a tension between those two things, right? In 2022, and I mean, this argument's been going on for much longer than that, the women's team was saying, why are we not getting paid as much if we are competing better? Some of that can be attributed to gender-based wage discrimination associated with women and men. I'm not saying that doesn't exist, but the response that was given was, well, more people watch the men's national team. We get tons of money from Coca-Cola for advertisements during the men's World Cup. There's not as much money in the women's World Cup. And that was part of their explanation. And if we're thinking about entertainment as like a marketable good, how are we measuring productivity? Is it how much you can get people to watch advertisements for Coca-Cola and Budweiser and I don't know, whatever other commercials come up, right? We can also kind of call it back to the Super Bowl advertisements and how much those cost, right? Or, and this is one that I think about pretty often, is it drama? When I reference drama here, it may not be immediately obvious depending on how much you think about this, but like, is anybody familiar with ESPN as a thing? Entertainment Sports Production Network, something, right? I don't think that's actually what the acronym stands for. That's a 24/7 news channel. They really only cover like 3 to 7 sports. Is there enough meaningful news about sports for them to really fill all of that up? Depending on the time of year, maybe, but I'm pretty astounded at how much time ESPN spends talking about the clothing that athletes wear before a game, right? Or the dramatic kind of interpersonal relationships that take place between J.R. Smith and LeBron James after J.R. Smith made a mistake in the NBA Finals 7 years ago, or other things like that. Tyreek Hill getting delayed on his way to his football game this past weekend, right? In some ways, like, yeah, that's stuff that we pay attention to because these are our heroes. But there's a lot of drama that just gets buried in there. It's like reality TV. Caitlin Clark versus Angel Reese, right? They played basketball against each other, but there were weeks where people were really, really dissecting the interpersonal events that were going on. And then all of the public commentary about that, right? So we have these different metrics for productivity. I'm curious what student athletes think is the most appropriate metric for productivity within the labor market, right? So in the last minute here, I have a few different cases that relate back to this question. One of them we've already kind of spoken about with the United States women's national soccer team and the wage disparity relative to the men's national soccer team. I think this is a good example for kind of demonstrating that there are conflicting goals within this market. But I also think about things like NFL quarterback salaries versus offensive lineman salaries, right? If we kind of think about productivity in sports as being focused on contributions to winning games, NFL quarterbacks matter for winning games, but the people who protect the quarterbacks do as well. The blindside tackle is often like the second highest paid player on a team. I can't tell you what a blindside tackle is. This is just something that a student told me once when I was talking about like, why do quarterbacks get paid so much when offensive linemen actually deserve it? And a student who was more knowledgeable, because I'm a lifelong learner, learning from students all the time, said, did you know that the blindside tackle often is the second highest paid player on a team? I said, I did not know that, but it's because they protect the quarterback, right? I've run out of time, and this is the last slide, so it works out okay. But I will say, like, this is the perfect time. Does anyone want to throw in some ideas about this distinction? NFL quarterbacks get paid a ton of money. Linemen often don't. What might be one reason for why? David?
I guess like the language around marketing, like when you hear people describe quarterbacks, it's always like crafty and playmaking, and the fact that they can throw the ball and also run as well. So it's like, I guess they're kind of marketed as like a hybrid athlete or like the best of the best.
Yeah.
While I don't believe it's about O-linemen, but sometimes O-linemen like simplified to like just like big guys who block, you know?
Yeah.
So I think it kind of revolves around like image. And when you see like a lot of people, when they think about like competing on a high level, they want to be the guy who like is seen as like the leader of the team rather than just someone who just blocks.
Yeah, so they want to be seen as the leader of the team, but also let me like there's even an element of that response too. It's like they want to be seen. Quarterbacks get the most screen time. Linemen should not have done that. But it demonstrates the point, right? They hit each other hard, and you never see their faces because their faces are in the faces of somebody else. The quarterback stands up tall, stands behind them, gets the most screen time because you want to watch where the ball is, and they have it until they throw it or if they run with it. So maybe it's screen time. Also, coming back to marketing, these are some of my ideas. I should pass the conversation to everybody else, but they have super long careers. 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, if your name is Aaron Rodgers or Tom Brady or Drew Brees, right? Marketing wise, they're going to be the spokesperson for Old Spice for a decade. Linemen have their knees destroyed. Sorry, I'm not actually a football player, but I'm pretty sure it's hard on their knees, right? So I think that there are a lot of ways that we can kind of like approach these types of questions. But with all that being said, I think that it's fun to study the labor market and think about how economics can be observed within these conversations. I'm happy to keep talking because I can't ever stop, but also love to hear other questions or topics. Yeah.
Would it be fair to say there's two separate I don't know much about economics, but would it be fair to say there's two separate markets then, one in between in each league and then out of league? Because I think there's a difference there when you're talking about women's national soccer and men's national soccer, which effectively are two different sports. And that has a lot to do, or not two different sports, but two different leagues.
Yeah.
And that being paid on an entertainment scale, whereas in the NFL, like quarterback to quarterback, it is more based off competition because at the end of the day, like when Dak Prescott got his new deal, it's based on his competition getting deals as well and how he stacks up to people like that.
Yeah.
But I would say for the first one, at the end of the day, NFL quarterbacks are who win you games. I know they do end up becoming the marketing tool in which teams work with, but
yeah,
like
it feels that way. But let me ask you this: if we're trying to use language that's not like reliant on a lot of economics education. So
token translate for me.
Yeah, if we think about the marginal contribution, which is this person's added value relative to their next best alternative, right? How many more games is Dak Prescott going to win you than another person who you could pay half as much, right? I think that's part of the questions that come up here, right? And we can continue to use the NFL as an example. It's like there's becoming a strategy, which is, okay, use your first draft picks on a quarterback that you can pay nothing because they're new and they're untested and they're uncertain, and spend your money elsewhere. If you're lucky enough to draft Brock Purdy, you can spend all of your money on Christian McCaffrey and Nick Bosa. I mean, so like, yeah, so we have a few different questions here, but first, you're totally right, which is different. Productivity will be different depending on the exact context in which you're studying. I agree with that entirely, especially when different sports have different exposure. But yes, like these are good questions.
Well, I think also if you're going to talk about like allocation of resources like between those positions, you are allocating them between multiple like entities in that offensive line instead of like one entity, which is the quarterback.
Yeah, so that's another interesting way to kind of slice the question, right? It's like, which are the cohesive units, right? A quarterback is the unit, not in like the weird way that that young people use the word unit now. It's like that person's a unit. Is that familiar?
Yes.
It means they're a very strong person.
Yes.
I think. Yeah. Apparently we've got a unit, but in my mind, that's like an incremental portion of a larger system. Like I guess I think about it like an engineer, but anyway. But yeah, like so I think that's another factor that kind of shows up there for sure. It's like instead of focusing on single positions, focusing on units. And so if you look at the allocation to the offensive line as a unit, maybe it's more competitive to that one person.
I have a question about like on the supply of labor in sports,
Mhm.
it seems like there's tons of people that compete to be
Yeah.
a quarterback in the NFL. And if that's true, there's all these people that could be, right? Are the people that are the quarterbacks significantly better than all those people? And how is it that gets calculated, right?
Yeah.
So I'm just kind of wondering, like it always seems to me like.
I have an answer,
what
but
is,
I
like,
also
the
want
technical
other
way
people to be
to
able
like
to.
make sense of how that works.
Well, there's a book, like Malcolm the Bylaws talked a lot about that. And part of it is saying that like, yeah, there are so many different people and like they will, like, really generational talents that we've probably missed like 99% of them. But that was just like in hockey, I think it's like 80, I'm gonna look at the stat. It's over 60% of athletes who compete in the NHL were born between the months of January and March. And that's because when you're playing Pee Wee hockey, it's like the cutoff, like in school, the cutoff for like when you are eligible to like join that Pee Wee hockey league is at the beginning of the year. And so then if you're getting chosen to be playing on the travel teams, like when you're like 5 years old, like those 8 months that you have, like on another person, like age-wise and physical development-wise, is like a really, really big like cause. And so like just like the way that like luck works and the way that like humans are filtered into this like athletic like view and like
There's
culture.
path dependency,
Yeah.
right? So like something that happens early on in life, such as when you were born, right? Like the month can actually have this big pronounced impact that echoes across your life. So that, I mean, again, we don't necessarily need to use words like path dependency, but I like it. Another answer, and we don't have to spend too much time because I know there are more questions too, but the compensation structure in professional sports is not like a compensation structure in a lot of other industries. In particular, they have essentially what's sometimes referred to as a tournament payoff structure. You become the best person in some kind of competitive task, right? Maybe it's like through several seasons of competing or a lifetime of playing different kind of grade scale or age scale competitions. But if you come out the end and you are the very best person, then you get like 80% of the money. Like I looked it up earlier, the median salary for professional athletes in the US, $70,000, right? I'm gonna plow through all of these slides real quick.
To injuries, right?
Well, that's interesting too.
Yeah.
But I'm not gonna do the math right in front of you, but $70,000 relative to 700 million, this is over 10 years. So that would be bad math anyway, but the median salary is 70,000 because most people get paid nothing and have really short careers. And then an incredibly small number of people get paid exorbitant amounts of money. And especially if we think, I get worked up about rule changes that have protected and extended the careers of quarterbacks in the NFL, because it seems very manufactured for them to win.
Yeah.
Like not just games, but like in life. It's like we change all the rules so they are more protected and have longer careers, and then we pay them the most too. But it's entertainment. Like people want to show up and watch the ball get aired out in 600 yards and all that stuff. So
if you're looking at like, I guess like sports that we consider like professional sports, like National League football and hockey and stuff, but what about like sports considered Olympic sports?
yeah,
And like, there's a divide there because
absolutely.
swimming's not considered a true sport here,
Right.
yet it's an Olympic sport.
Yeah, so I would say that's an even more extreme case of that kind of like tournament structure, right? I can say the name Michael Phelps or Katie Ledecky.
Yeah.
People know that. Maybe 5 more swimmers if they're lucky, if you're not a swimmer yourself, right? But within this room, if I kind of give a survey of like names, we might get 7. If I ask for professional football players, it'd be way more. So I would actually say that that's another place where you could kind of examine the tournament structure of compensation, but like to the most extreme level possible. Like, and especially in sports where we kind of primarily measure things in terms of like centimeters, grams, and seconds, these Olympic sports, right? Which an interesting element of that is like, if you actually want to measure true athleticism, how fast are you? How high can you jump? How much can you lift, right? Just athleticism, where it's not really based on, let's say, skills that deal with something else. I think that's actually pretty interesting. But also how like we don't compensate that. We say these are the athletes, even though they're using tools. Maybe that's anthropology and we're human beings and we like using tools. It's like, who's the best athlete? Maybe the fastest, strongest, highest jumping person, but we don't like to watch that, you know? So, pardon me, to answer the question, I would say those types of sports is just like a really, really extreme example of that tournament payoff structure. You're not the top 0.1% of people in order to become a household name. You're the top 0.0000001% of people in order to become a household name. Otherwise, you're probably paying to play, honestly. Like that's another huge thing that I think about with like sports economics. It's like, what about these sports where you essentially pay to play? Can't look at that in the labor market. You're essentially just being like, well, sounds like it's like consumption associated with pain and injury, right? Like I've never been paid to go to a tournament, and I've gone to a nationally competitive tournament and I paid hundreds of dollars to do it. It sucks.
I love that you're bringing in the issue of consumption, right? And I teach a class that's leisure working consumption in US history. And it seemed to me that your model in many of your sort of three item model, and at the very least, competition and drama are both very consumption related. Right. So it's I mean, often it feels like consumption as we're using it is people watching. Right. So consumption is about eyeballs, right? I mean, so there's other ways that we consume athletics, right? So we could even think of people playing as a form of consumption, right? If it's those folks who pay play, right? They're consuming the experience and the thrill and the challenges and the things that they
and
enjoy,
everything
right?
else they could be doing with their time.
I mean,
I mean, that's a huge element of participating in these things, right? Athletes work super hard. And I also want to kind of bring it back to where it's like, it's not just consumption or just entertainment. Oftentimes it's culture. It could be family relationships. Like, you know, I believe that there are communities and families where like getting together to watch the Arkansas Razorbacks is a huge part of the way that they spend time together. And so maybe the football doesn't even matter. Maybe there are people who go to football games or watch football games every week. They don't know the names of the players. They're not paying attention to who is winning or whatever. They're spending time with the people that they care about. And that's just a space for them to be with others. That's a good thing. Maybe that's worth paying people millions of dollars to provide that thing that we gravitate around, right? But then there's always that nagging part of like, it's a game, right? It's it's just watching TV, right? But I think that there is more depth to it as well.
Is there something in economics where like we pay people tons of money because they're like near priceless? Like in art, it seems like there's things that like we put a huge dollar amount on because it's the case that we want to say this is priceless. What would that be in economics? Like it's beyond valuing quantitatively, but all we got is money. So.
I think that's there's. I would have to ponder that more, so I don't have an immediate response. But my attempt is that if you're using economics to primarily study markets, which there are other ways to use economics, it's hard to answer that question because markets they don't exist just to assign value, but it's one way that we can interpret the way that we value things. And in a way that runs counter to this idea of pricelessness.
I think a better way to look at that is timeless in sports, other than price, because of course, like the way we look at sports is like you play this sport. Where it's like these guys, I don't know, when you talk about like their careers, like surely time might be different, like that's a fat contract. But with a lot of guys like Michael Jordan, like played X amount of years or X amount of seasons and won X amount of championships. And like that creation of like value through the time that they played, that is shown
through like documentaries.
And also bringing it back to art, right? So I apologize, Joe. Please finish your
You're
point.
the professional. I would love to hear.
But it's a space for us. I want to learn from you. I want to learn from you, Joe. But you bring up a good point, and it kind of gels with what I was thinking about too. And also this idea of art markets, right? And bring it back to thank you for teaching me something when I invited you to lecture in my class that those few months ago. There are artifacts of the times in which those people played. So sports memorabilia, I think, probably functions a lot like an art market. So if there are trading cards from Michael Jordan's rookie season, I bet it's worth a lot of money. You know, I'd be curious to see if there are like certain elements of like sports memorabilia that are maybe even worth more than whatever that person's salary was when they were playing, because it's kind of a crystallization of memories and experiences of watching, like Joe Montana back whenever he was in San Francisco. I mean, I guess he was always in San Francisco, but yeah.
Yeah, one of my favorite articles is written by David Foster Wallace. It's called Roger Federer as a Religious Experience. I don't know if you've ever read that article, but in that article, it talks about Roger Federer not in terms of a great tennis player, but in terms of someone who like breaks the laws of nature in front of you. Like he like has a kind of freedom and movement in his bodily movement that generates a religious experience. So like, in a sense, this is like adding to your list, right?
Yeah.
Like it's an aesthetic appreciation of like a human being that goes beyond what other human beings can do.
Yeah.
And if human beings go beyond what other human beings can do, like in the Greek sense, they're gods, right? Like they've become gods. And so in a sense, it's like that is something that's aesthetically appealing. It like makes us have a moment of being like, wow, I didn't know this was possible. And in the article, it talks about like his partner comes in and he's watching Roger Federer do these awesome movements, and he's jumping up and down on the couch, and the popcorn spills everywhere, and it's like he was having a mystical experience, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's important too. That experience of sports is important.
I think that point is so interesting too, because you said they kind of become gods, and it's interesting in a sports sense that like at the end of the day in 20 years that gets one upped almost every time just based on genetics. Like I was thinking when you were talking about things worth more than people's salary, like Babe Ruth, if anything that you touch Babe Ruth is alive today, like
he made like $15 per game or something.
Exactly. No, it's priceless. And
But it's good money back in the day.
Yes.
it's just an interesting point that like Roger Federer is someone who people have looked up to as God, and now I wonder if there's 10 tennis players.
Alcazar,
Yeah.
Maybe.
I was just thinking that, like, I guess in reference to competition, because like Simone Biles, like she does stuff that most people, even in this generation, couldn't even attempt. Like they've banned a lot of her moves simply because it'd be too dangerous for someone else to like attempt them. So like it makes me think about like how someone can watch such a like impressive display, especially over the Olympics, and then like during the regular season, no one really cares about gymnastics anymore.
Yeah.
And then like I feel like almost like the competition of the Olympics is like what unifies people to actually be interested in, like finally they care about who's the strongest or fastest, who can jump the highest. Yeah. And who's most, I don't know, it's just interesting to me how like I guess the competition aspect of the Olympics kind of drives that.
It is, so it could be the competition aspect, or it could also be there's one time every 4 years where advertisers pay to be seen during that event. Like those mega, like those sports mega events. I've given lectures on like the Olympics, World Cup, other things like that, where it's like, what are the economics of mega events, especially international events, right? Yeah, there's a hand somewhere.
Well, I think the cool thing about the price part, like the prices, is that like the cool thing about looking at it in the economics way is like there is a price for it, like it's found in the market. Like,
And yes, yeah,
like
absolutely.
It has to be. And so it's like even when talking about art, like there is a price, like it's found in that market. That's how like the free world works.
And another element of that too is like, I said earlier, and I believe this, that markets, one of the main things we can take away from them is that prices are a representation of what we value, right? And we use value in a lot of senses. You have a class, I believe, called like what is value? Maybe not. Maybe it's what is truth, and then you talk about value. But we use value in a lot of contexts. And this is one metric for it. I don't think it's the only metric for it. There's a lot of things that we value that don't have a price. Sorry, Ellen, I keep gravitating over here. But I don't believe that market value is the only type of value. However, I think that they're probably correlated, right? So if sports memorabilia, I don't know why I'm pointing here, if sports memorabilia commands a really high price, it may not be the same as the true value that it has granted to society or that individual who bought it or whatever. But I bet they move in the same direction. That's a cop-out. Like that's just using math to be like, well, it's not the same thing, but they move in the same direction. But I believe it.
So then what about, so I'm following up on this further idea of value that's created that we don't measure.
Yeah.
Right? Does community building fit anywhere on the X graph or anywhere, right? Because a lot of the experiences that we've been talking about, right? And this, it made me think of this when you brought up Michael Jordan, right? And so I actually lived in Chicago when he was winning all of those championships. I didn't know watch basketball. Like I didn't have to, right? The whole city, like when they won the scoring point, the whole city went, whoa, like all at the same time, everybody's outside screaming, the whole city screamed, right? Like it was super exciting. Even though the band could fly, right? So it was like, I didn't watch it very often, I didn't have to, once or twice,
And so I believe part of the question was, is that feeling, that community aspect, is that something that we ever measure? I would say that we can't measure it perfectly, but it is buried somewhat within the demand function. Because if we think about sports events, and I know that you mentioned that it's like, even people who didn't go to the game, they were feeling that. But the people who went to the game were totally feeling that. And some people go to those games for that feeling, right? It's like, it's the mob, right? I believe that people have many reasons to go to sporting events. But this collective effervescence that we spoke about last week with Durkheim, right? That is something that is like really tangible and people love it. I think it's a human reaction. And so it would be within that demand function because it probably influences how much they're willing to pay for it. And let's talk about the community side of it too. You shared with us your memories from being in Chicago during those days. There are certainly people who kind of cherish the fact that they can share the story of when they saw Michael Jordan in the Bulls arena with the light show and the like they can share that with their grandkids or some child that lives down the street or they meet at church or whatever, right? So like I think that's, pardon me, the economics response would be that's buried within here. So some technical information that we didn't get into is thinking about what determines the prices that consumers are willing to pay. To rattle them off, it's like income, because that's relevant, but it's also tastes and preferences, people's expectations, the availability of substitute goods, the price of complementary goods. There are a lot of things that we could say. The big one is tastes and preferences. Now, within economics, we just say, we take preferences as given, we see how much people are willing to pay, and some of that can be attributed to the stuff they like. In philosophy or psychology, or other disciplines, they're like, no, we really want to know why people like those things. In economics, like, who cares about the inputs? We care about what we can see. So we're going to take preferences as given. We're going to study how people behave through their revealed preferences, and then we're going to make predictions based on it. So in a way, I guess I'm explaining why I don't have a more compelling response other than it's in there somewhere. But economists are like, well, we just look at people's behavior. We don't necessarily care why they're headed that way. So
P.S. little plug for history, we do care, and we also what people want like changes over time. Right?
Oh yeah. And then we just model that.
I do ultra running, right? So like people, did you know that people used to go to stadiums and watch people run around in circles for like 100?
That's
wild.
Well, it's like
they used to watch ultra running, and when I go out there, no one's watching.
No one wants to just follow you like down a trail for 100 miles.
back in the day, I used to do a legitimate sport. Like, people used to show up at stadiums to watch it, and lots of people did.
Yeah.
Right, so yeah, historically.
Well, and people do that for cycling. Crit racing is still really big, and they just go to the velodrome and they just stare at people running in circles. Or NASCAR, right? I mean, NASCAR people, they're the ultra ones. They're probably doing like 1,000 miles.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not too knowledgeable about that sport, but yeah.
And breathing all that exhaust.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
This is proof that I don't think like an economist.
That's fine. We need other people to think.
So I went to Hendrix, my dad went to Hendrix, my mom went to Centenary. I was compelled to go to the Hendrix Centenary football game Saturday. I also used to live in Shreveport.
Yeah.
So I mean, it was like, I'm going. I mean, I want to go to support the team anyway, but there was this draw there, and it and I know the chaplain there, and I just said, "Hey, are you going to be there?" Texted her, and she's like, "Yeah, you want to do the opening invocation with me?"
Oh, that's great.
And so we got to we wrote a dialogue invocation over text and everything, and we're able to do that at the beginning of the game. So that's some of that like intrinsic. You just can't put a price on it, but it's so valuable. And the other thing I've thought about since you were talking about this is, so you might know who Jenny Finch is, Olympic gold and silver medal winner when there was women's fast pitch softball in the Olympics of the sport.
Oh, I think I know
Before
this story. Yeah.
So she lives down in Lake Charles, where I was from. She came from a church there, and she goes around and does camps and stuff with folks. She invented this pitching training thing, and she's quite the thing. So I have a poster that she signed in my office, Dream and Believe, and a science softball.
Yep.
And I never till this minute thought about what would that be worth in dollars. I mean, I have a really, you know, I never until we're talking here.
But that's not to say that it doesn't have value either, right?
Right.
You know, so like there's always that distinction. Yeah.
You want to see an Olympian? Come to my office.
Right.
I've got it up there where I can see it every time I turn from my desk.
How do we like complicate the equation to account for like now that like the industry is moving away from like its primary revenue source of ticket sales? And then like understanding that like as it like develops away from like as it was in like I don't know like the 20s, where it's like we make this money because people come to see this player, and it's like you now have like the Cheyenne County deal with like its New Balance deal, and like how it's like almost woven into like the Dodgers deal as well with like the colorways and like brand activations.
Right. So one immediate response that I have here is any model from economics or biology, models that are used in history or whatever, is always a simplification of reality. So it's never going to be perfectly the same as what we actually see in the world. We can learn something from it. So that's just a quick statement. But I think that kind of your question was like, how do we complicate this equation and make it more refined to the real world? Well, we talked about ways that you could elaborate on measurements of productivity, but I think you're also talking about how could we elaborate on the way that we define prices in terms of the good that's being sold. So you would have to take a bunch of linear algebra courses to essentially, there we go, David's in, to instead of have one variable multiplied by another variable, to have a vector of variables multiplied by another vector, right? And so then you would get into matrix algebra, and there would be ways to look at optimizing across that. It's going to require more math skills, or you can just say, screw the math and write a paper. You know, like you were asking about the equations. And so one way to make it more complex is to take advantage of the fact that we do have more sophisticated methods for looking at high dimensional problems. One of those ways would be to use linear algebra to incorporate more information into each one of these symbols by making them vectors. And then you could optimize over that. Another way is to set the math aside and take a more subjective approach to it.
Can I ask you a question that's It's an economics question, but it's also kind of a justice question, which is, for you, what's the difference between like college athletics and professional athletics? How is college athletics like not compensated in ways that like fit with like what they actually do? For me, college football seems way more interesting than professional football, but it seems like they either don't get paid as much or like don't get paid at all.
So
and then like what about athletes at the school like Hendrix?
My number one response.
Don't get paid anything, but they do a lot for the college.
My number one response is the slow creep of cultural heritage that has allowed for an exploitive system to exist. So I'll elaborate on that. College sports used to just be something that people did outside. Let me rephrase that. College sports teams have not always been as much of a money generating industry as they are today, right? So like the first football game was Princeton and Rutgers, like and these people weren't looking at careers in football afterwards, right? And so while that's happening as a community thing, so the Hendrix Flying Squirrels is a non-NCAA team that has a strong cultural heritage. It's been around for like 25 years. I'm a member of it. I've met people who graduated in 2004, and I know people who will graduate in and I know people who graduated in 2024. They're friends of mine, and I have that shared cultural heritage with them. There's no money there, right? Over the decades, the latter half of the 20th century, and I would attribute a lot of this to, speaking very quickly, I would attribute a lot of this to extreme economic growth within high-income societies that give us more time and more money to spend on recreation and entertainment. So now you have all these people who have money and time to spend on recreational activities, and they have college degrees from places that they see on television all the time with football teams, and it starts making money. But it's attached to a school, right? Over decades, we have this slow creep of more and more money being generated, but this cultural heritage that it's attached to a place that is not a private team, right? And so now you have labor exploitation. Like that's all I think about, or pardon me, I think about many things when I watch college football. One of the things that I think about is we need to, this is my feeling, and I think that a lot of people disagree with me, especially alumni who get excited about their teams. I would love to see college, and I say this to a room with many student athletes in it, I'd love to see colleges and semi-professional athletics separated, so that like models in Europe where they have Division I, Division II, Premier League soccer, but Division I and Division II players get paid for their work, not for their name, image, and likeness, but for their labor. They just get paid because they're part of a private organization that exists to support competitive endeavors, but it's not attached to a school. How does that happen here? I have no clue. But we have this system where we have two things which are not the same, and I'm referencing D1 in particular. They're not the same goals, but they're tied together. And there's this cultural heritage that is going to make it really hard to separate them. You see it a little bit, I'm rambling here, but I've thought about it. You see it a little bit with the G League, which is the developmental league for the National Basketball Association. Those players get paid for their labor. They're not paid for their name, image, and likeness, because I know that that's a step that's being moved in that way with the NCAA. But that's not for their football playing or their swimming or whatever else. It is for their marketing. And they're not legally allowed to be paid for the work that they're actually doing.
So you think there still should be sports and athletics at colleges? It just shouldn't be continuous with a path towards professional sports that they should separate.
I think that we should have developmental leagues that allow those people to get paid, and if they choose to go to school as well, that's their choice.
Oh, and long-term health insurance. You get injured at 19.
Yeah,
that could be a lifetime of.
Sorry, I really went off, but I think about this a lot.
My question would be then, what about a lot of football players, say, who go to a school in order to, if they could not earlier afford school?
Yeah, that is a super important factor. And just so that I don't respond to a question that I cut you off on, So for many students, athletics is a route to affordable education. If I snap my fingers and we dissect these two things, because I was saying that they're separate, but they can be connected, what do we do to make school more affordable? I think that there are routes to making school affordable that are unrelated to athletics. And I would like to see that type of work done.
Yeah, I think the scholarship is almost used as a justification in some ways as to why.
For some people, and I agree, sorry, I keep cutting, but like, so a scholarship at some Division I schools is a form of non-wage compensation, but those people are really getting recruited to be athletes, and then they're just paid with the scholarship, but maybe they don't even have degree aspirations. Is that kind of what you're describing?
Or I was just gonna say that like it's used in arguments as to why not being paid is.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm saying if you separated it, like you could use that as a way, and then if they were compensated even like 1% of the value they're providing, they would be able to afford 8 educations.
Yeah.
Well, let's thank Dr. Chomsky for coming in. Next week, we have an open discussion on the athlete, non-athlete divide, or whatever people are kind of calling it. And so I'd like students to lead that discussion. So if there are any students that would be interested in leading that discussion, have them contact me.
I didn't put my email up here, but I'm happy to have these conversations. We can grab a meal, set up a meeting. Doesn't have to be in my office, but I'm happy to talk about economics or other things like that. So thank you all for your attention.